Picture this. A grown man standing in his own backyard, surrounded by 5 HOA board members, their arms crossed, faces stern, demanding he tear down a fence that had been standing peacefully for over 3 years. The fence wasn't blocking anyone's view, wasn't violating any actual city codes, and wasn't hurting a soul. But according to these self-appointed neighborhood dictators, it had to go. What they did not know was that they had just picked a fight with someone who had spent 25 years as a real estate attorney, someone who knew property law better than they knew their own manufactured rules. The confrontation that followed would expose years of HOA corruption, result in 3 board resignations, and completely transform how this community operated. But more importantly, it would prove that sometimes the little guy can win against bureaucratic bullies who think a clipboard and a bad attitude give them unlimited power. Where are you watching from? Please feel free to leave a comment below, as you are about to witness how one homeowner turned the tables on an HOA that thought they were untouchable. Meet David Chen, a 52-year-old real estate attorney who thought he had found his perfect retirement community in Meadowbrook Estates, a planned community in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. After decades of fighting legal battles for other people, David was looking forward to a quiet life tending his garden, reading legal thrillers, and maybe teaching some part-time law classes at the local community college. Meadowbrook Estates seemed like the ideal place to settle down. The community was established in 1998, featuring 847 homes arranged around a central clubhouse, 2 tennis courts, and a small community pool. The homes were well-maintained, the streets were clean, and the HOA fees were reasonable at $180 per month. The community attracted a mix of young families and retirees, creating what appeared to be a balanced, harmonious neighborhood. David purchased his home at 1247 Sycamore Lane in March 2019, a charming 3-bedroom ranch with a spacious backyard that backed up to a small desert preserve. The previous owners had installed a 6-foot cedar privacy fence along the back property line, creating a natural boundary between the maintained yard and the wild desert beyond. The fence was beautiful, well-constructed, and served its purpose perfectly. It kept the occasional javelina and coyote from wandering into the yard while providing privacy from the hiking trail that ran through the preserve. But you know how the saying goes. If something seems too good to be true, it probably is. The Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association was run by a 5-person board elected by the community residents. On paper, this seemed democratic and reasonable. In reality, the same 5 people had been rotating positions among themselves for nearly a decade, creating what was essentially a closed circle of power that operated with minimal oversight from the general community. The board president was Margaret Whitfield, a 67-year-old retired school administrator who had moved to Meadowbrook in 2003. Margaret approached her HOA duties with the same iron fist she had used to run her elementary school, except now, instead of managing children, she was trying to control the lives of nearly 800 adult homeowners. She was known for her surprise compliance walks, where she would patrol the neighborhood with a clipboard, documenting everything from trash cans left out too long to holiday decorations that exceeded her personal taste standards. Next was Harold Brinkman, the vice president and Margaret's most loyal supporter. Harold was a retired insurance adjuster who seemed to find genuine joy in denying claims and finding reasons to say no to resident requests. He had been on the board for 8 years and had never met an HOA rule he didn't want to make stricter. The treasurer was Linda Morrison, a woman who treated the HOA's modest budget like she was managing the Federal Reserve. Linda was notorious for questioning every expenditure over $50, while somehow always finding money in the budget for new compliance monitoring equipment and legal fees to harass residents. Joyce Patterson rounded out the group as secretary, though her primary role seemed to be taking detailed notes of every perceived violation and resident complaint for future reference. Joyce had an uncanny ability to remember every minor infraction from years past and would bring up past violations during seemingly unrelated discussions. Finally, there was Robert Kim, the newest board member who had joined just 6 months before David moved in. Robert was different from the others. He actually seemed to want to serve the community rather than control it. This difference in philosophy would prove crucial as events unfolded. Now, here's where things get interesting, and this is something that will blow your mind about how HOAs can manipulate their own rules. For the first 18 months, David lived peacefully in his home. He participated in community events, attended a few HOA meetings out of civic duty, and maintained his property meticulously. He even volunteered to help with the annual community garage sale and the holiday decoration contest. As far as he knew, he was the model resident. The fence had been there when he bought the house. It was clearly visible in all the listing photos mentioned in the property description and had been standing for years without any apparent issues. The home inspection had noted it as a positive feature, and David's real estate agent, who was familiar with the community, never mentioned any potential HOA concerns about it. But in September 2020, David received his first indication that his peaceful retirement might not go as planned. It started with a knock on his door on a Tuesday morning. David opened it to find Margaret Whitfield standing on his porch, clipboard in hand, accompanied by Harold Brinkman, who was taking photos of David's backyard with what appeared to be a professional camera. Margaret's greeting was anything but neighborly. Without so much as a hello, she announced that they were conducting a compliance review of his property and that they had concerns about his fence. When David asked what specific concerns they had, Margaret's response was vague but ominous. The fence might not be in compliance with current community standards, and they would be investigating the matter further. David, drawing on his legal training, asked to see the specific HOA rules or covenants that his fence might be violating. Margaret's response? She would get back to him with that information. Harold continued taking photos without explanation, shooting from multiple angles and even attempting to photograph the fence from inside David's backyard by reaching his camera over the side gate. This is the moment when David should have realized he was dealing with people who viewed HOA rules not as community guidelines, but as weapons to be used against residents they decided they didn't like. What happened next would test David's patience and ultimately prove that some people should never be given even the smallest amount of authority over others. 3 days after Margaret's visit, David found a certified letter in his mailbox. The return address showed Meadowbrook Estates HOA, but the contents read more like a declaration of war than a neighborly communication. Now, here's where David's legal background became invaluable, and where the HOA's first major mistake was revealed. David immediately pulled out his copy of the community covenants, something every homeowner receives at closing but few actually read. He went straight to Section 4.7, expecting to find specific language about fences and property boundaries. What he found instead was a section about architectural control and approval that dealt with new construction and modifications to existing structures. But here's the kicker, and this is something that will make you question every HOA communication you've ever received. The fence had been installed in 2017, 3 years before David even bought the house. According to the covenants, any architectural concerns had to be raised within 90 days of construction completion, or the HOA waived its right to challenge the structure. David had them dead to rights on a basic legal technicality, but he decided to approach the situation diplomatically first. He drafted a polite but firm response letter, explaining that the fence had been grandfathered under the covenant's own time limitations, and requesting that the violation notice be withdrawn. Margaret's response came not in writing, but in the form of another unannounced visit, this time with the entire board in tow, except for Robert Kim. Standing on David's front porch, Margaret announced that the board had reviewed his letter and determined that the fence was still in violation regardless of when it was built. When David asked for the legal basis of this determination, Harold jumped in with what can only be described as creative interpretation of HOA law. According to Harold, the time limitation only applied to the original homeowner, and since David was a new owner, the clock had reset when he purchased the property. This interpretation was not only legally incorrect, but demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of how property rights work. But wait, it gets worse, and this is the part that will make your blood boil. David politely explained that this interpretation was incorrect and that property rights and covenant limitations transfer with the deed. Margaret's response was to inform David that the board had consulted with their attorney and that they were confident in their position. David asked to see this legal opinion. Margaret's response: the board's legal consultations were privileged communications and not subject to homeowner review. This is when David realized he was dealing with people who were either completely ignorant of basic legal principles or were deliberately misrepresenting the law to intimidate him. Either way, their next move would prove they had seriously underestimated who they were messing with. The following week, David received another certified letter, this time informing him that since he had failed to respond to their initial violation notice, daily fines of $50 would begin accruing immediately. The letter was dated exactly 30 days after the first notice, suggesting the board had been counting down the days regardless of David's response letter. Now, remember that David had responded both in writing and in person. The board was simply choosing to ignore his response because it didn't align with their predetermined outcome. But here's where their petty power play took an even more disturbing turn. David discovered that Margaret had been conducting what she called enhanced compliance monitoring of his property. This involved driving slowly past his house multiple times per day, taking photographs of his yard from the street, and even attempting to peer over his fence from the desert preserve side using what appeared to be a stepladder. When David confronted Margaret about this behavior during the next community meeting, her response was that as HOA president, she had the right and responsibility to monitor all community properties for violations. David calmly explained that while the HOA did have certain oversight responsibilities, they did not have the right to harass residents or conduct surveillance activities. Margaret's response was to motion for David to be removed from the meeting for disrupting board business. And here's the moment that changed everything, a moment that would expose years of HOA corruption and abuse. Robert Kim, the newest board member, stood up and said something that shocked everyone in the room. "Margaret, I think we need to actually review our legal authority here. I've been reading the covenants, and I'm not sure we're on solid ground with this fence issue." The look on Margaret's face was priceless. Harold immediately jumped in to support Margaret. Linda started shuffling through papers looking for some rule to cite, and Joyce frantically scribbled notes as if documenting Robert's insubordination. But Robert wasn't finished. He continued, "I've also noticed that we've been spending a lot of money on legal fees lately, and I think the community deserves to know what those fees are for." This single comment would unravel a web of financial mismanagement and legal abuse that had been going on for years. You see, David wasn't the first resident to be targeted by Margaret's board. Over the previous 3 years, they had initiated similar violation procedures against 17 other homeowners for various minor infractions. In each case, the homeowners had either complied with demands or moved away, rather than fight the board. But David was different. David knew the law, had the resources to fight back, and most importantly, had the determination to expose what was really going on. His investigation into the board's activities would reveal financial irregularities, conflict of interest violations, and a pattern of selective enforcement that bordered on harassment. But before he could expose any of this, the board would make one final desperate attempt to force him into compliance. And that attempt would prove to be their biggest mistake yet. The confrontation that would ultimately destroy Margaret Whitfield's stranglehold on the Meadowbrook Estates community began with what can only be described as an act of desperation disguised as legal authority. On a crisp October morning, David was enjoying his coffee in his backyard when he heard the unmistakable sound of power tools coming from directly behind his fence. He walked to the back of his property to investigate and was shocked to find 3 men with chainsaws and sledgehammers beginning to dismantle his fence from the desert preserve side. When David demanded to know what they were doing, one of the workers handed him a work order signed by Margaret Whitfield authorizing the removal of unpermitted structures encroaching on common area property. Here's where Margaret made her fatal error, and this is something that will absolutely blow your mind. The fence wasn't on common area property. It was entirely within David's property lines, as clearly shown on his survey and deed. Margaret had authorized the destruction of private property based on completely false information. But it gets worse. When David called the police to report the property destruction in progress, he discovered that Margaret had called them first, claiming that David was interfering with authorized HOA maintenance activities. The responding officer, Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, found herself in the middle of what appeared to be a neighborhood dispute, but quickly realized she was dealing with something much more serious. David presented his property survey, his deed, and his title insurance policy, all clearly showing that the fence was entirely on his property. Margaret presented a hand-drawn map that she claimed showed the fence encroaching on community land. Sergeant Rodriguez took one look at Margaret's evidence and immediately ordered the work crew to stop. She then informed Margaret that authorizing the destruction of private property was a criminal matter and that she would be filing a report with the district attorney's office. Margaret's response was to demand that the officer arrest David for trespassing on HOA property by standing in his own backyard. This is the moment when Margaret's years of unchecked power and authority finally caught up with her. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been polite but professional up to this point, looked Margaret dead in the eye and said something that would become legendary in the Meadowbrook community. "Ma'am, I need you to understand something very clearly. You do not have the authority to authorize destruction of private property, regardless of what position you hold in your HOA. What happened here today is criminal property destruction, and you are personally liable for it." But Margaret wasn't done digging her own grave. Her response was to threaten to have Sergeant Rodriguez reported to her superiors for failing to enforce community covenant violations. The officer's patience finally ran out. She informed Margaret that she would be receiving a citation for filing a false police report and that any further attempts to destroy David's property would result in criminal charges. Now, you might think this would be enough to end the conflict. But Margaret's next move would prove that some people never learn when they're beaten. That evening, David received an emergency certified letter from the HOA board calling for a special assessment of $15,000 per household to cover unexpected legal and maintenance expenses. The letter, signed by all board members except Robert Kim, stated that failure to pay the assessment within 15 days would result in a lien being placed on each property. This was Margaret's nuclear option. If she couldn't force David to remove his fence through direct action, she would bankrupt the entire community and blame him for it. But Margaret had made a critical error in her desperation. She had just provided David with evidence of what lawyers call malicious prosecution and abuse of process. More importantly, she had finally given him grounds to go on the offensive. David spent the next week conducting what can only be described as a legal investigation that would have made a prosecutor proud. Using his knowledge of property law and public records access, he began uncovering a pattern of abuse that went far beyond his fence dispute. Here's what he found, and this will make you question every HOA in America. Over the previous 4 years, Margaret's board had initiated legal action against 23 different homeowners for various violations. In each case, they had used the same attorney, a man named Bradley Hutchins, who happened to be Margaret's brother-in-law. The legal fees paid to Hutchins over this period totaled more than $180,000, money that came directly from the community's reserve funds that were supposed to be used for maintenance and emergency repairs. But here's the really shocking part. In reviewing the legal outcomes of these 23 cases, David discovered that the HOA had never actually won a single court judgment. Most cases ended with homeowners settling rather than fighting, not because the HOA was right, but because fighting was more expensive than complying. David also discovered that Margaret had been approving expenditures without board approval, Harold had been using HOA funds to pay for his personal legal disputes, and Linda had been borrowing from the reserve fund to cover operational shortfalls without documenting the transactions. Joyce's detailed violation records, which she had maintained with such meticulous care, revealed a pattern of selective enforcement that targeted specific homeowners while ignoring identical violations by others. Coincidentally, the homeowners who were ignored included Margaret's personal friends and Harold's poker buddies. But the most damaging discovery was yet to come. David found that the board had been operating under a version of the community covenants that had been modified without homeowner approval. The changes, made in 2018, had given the board significantly more power to impose fines and assessments while reducing homeowner rights to appeal board decisions. These modifications were not only invalid under state law, but constituted fraud against the entire community. Armed with this information, David made a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply defending himself against the fence violation, he would expose the entire corrupt system and demand accountability. His first move was to request a special community meeting to present his findings to all homeowners. Under the community bylaws, such a meeting could be called by any homeowner and had to be granted within 14 days. Margaret's response was to deny the request, claiming that David's personal legal disputes were not appropriate subjects for community meetings. This was her final mistake. David's response was to file a lawsuit not just against the HOA, but against each board member personally for breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of funds, and violation of state HOA regulations. But more importantly, he sent a detailed summary of his findings to every homeowner in the community, along with copies of the financial records and legal documents that supported his claims. The community's reaction was swift and decisive. The 48 hours following David's community-wide disclosure would prove that sometimes the truth really can set people free, and that corrupt officials can only maintain power as long as people don't know what they're really doing. David's documentation package hit the community like a bombshell. Within hours of delivery, his phone was ringing constantly with calls from outraged neighbors who were finally understanding why their HOA fees kept increasing while community amenities kept deteriorating. Mrs. Patterson from Pine Street called to report that she now understood why her violation notice for a children's playhouse had resulted in $1,200 in legal fees when her neighbor's identical playhouse had never been questioned. Mr. Rodriguez from Oak Lane realized why his request to install solar panels had been denied while Harold's friend had been approved for an identical installation the same month. Most shocking of all, David discovered he wasn't even Margaret's primary target. The real story emerged when Robert Kim finally felt safe enough to speak openly about what he had witnessed during his 6 months on the board. Robert revealed that Margaret had been systematically targeting residents she viewed as undesirable, which included anyone who questioned board decisions, attended too many meetings, or simply rubbed her the wrong way. David's fence had become Margaret's obsession, not because it violated any legitimate rule, but because David had politely disagreed with her during a community meeting about the proposed increase in HOA fees. In Margaret's mind, this disagreement was insubordination that needed to be punished. But here's where the story takes an even more disturbing turn that will make you realize how dangerous unchecked HOA power can become. Robert revealed that Margaret had been maintaining what she called a watch list of problematic residents. This list included detailed notes about each resident's political affiliations, personal relationships, family situations, and anything else Margaret viewed as useful leverage. She had been using this information to make decisions about violation enforcement, vendor selection, and even community event planning. Residents who were on Margaret's good side received warnings before violations were formally issued. Residents on her bad side received certified letters without prior notice and faced the maximum penalties allowed under the covenants. The special assessment that had been proposed to cover legal fees wasn't actually needed to cover existing costs. It was Margaret's attempt to build a war chest for future legal battles against residents she planned to target. David's legal expertise had made him a particularly attractive target because Margaret viewed attorneys as inherently threatening to her authority. The fence violation was simply her chosen weapon to drive him out of the community. But Margaret had made one critical miscalculation. She had assumed David would respond like her previous targets by either complying quietly or moving away to avoid the hassle. Instead, David had done what every corrupt official fears most. He had followed the money and exposed the truth. The community's response to David's revelations was unprecedented in Meadowbrook's history. Within 1 week, more than 400 homeowners had signed a petition demanding the immediate resignation of Margaret, Harold, Linda, and Joyce. The petition also called for a complete audit of HOA finances and the reversal of all pending violation actions. Margaret's response was to call another emergency board meeting where she would address the false accusations being made against her leadership. The meeting, held on a Thursday evening in the community clubhouse, drew more than 300 residents, the largest attendance in the community's history. Margaret had clearly expected to control the narrative and dismiss David's claims as the complaints of a disgruntled homeowner. What happened instead was a complete repudiation of everything Margaret had built over her years in power. One by one, homeowners stood up to share their own stories of HOA abuse. Mrs. Chen described how she had been fined $500 for holiday decorations that were virtually identical to ones Margaret had approved for her friends. Mr. Thompson explained how he had been forced to repaint his house twice because Margaret claimed the approved color looked different in natural light than it had in the sample. Most damaging of all, several homeowners revealed that they had been approached privately by Margaret with offers to make their violation problems disappear in exchange for support during board elections. David didn't even need to present his legal case. The community was doing it for him. By the end of the meeting, Margaret was facing something she had never experienced in her years of HOA dictatorship, a room full of people who weren't afraid of her anymore. The final blow came when Robert Kim formally called for a vote of no confidence in Margaret's leadership. The vote wasn't even close. 287 residents voted to remove Margaret from the board, with only 12 votes in support of her remaining. Harold, Linda, and Joyce, seeing which way the wind was blowing, submitted their resignations that night rather than face similar votes. But the most satisfying moment came when Margaret made one final attempt to assert her authority. As residents were filing out of the meeting, Margaret stood up and announced that as the duly elected president, she would not recognize the vote and intended to continue serving in her position. David's response was calm, professional, and devastating. Margaret, under Arizona state law, HOA board members serve at the pleasure of the community. Tonight, the community has made it very clear that your service is no longer desired. If you attempt to continue acting as an HOA official after tonight, you'll be doing so without legal authority, and any actions you take will be subject to personal liability. Margaret's face went through a range of emotions: anger, disbelief, and finally resignation. She gathered her papers, walked out of the clubhouse, and never returned. The aftermath of that meeting would transform Meadowbrook Estates into the kind of community it was always supposed to be. Robert Kim was elected as interim president while new board elections were organized. His first official act was to suspend all pending violation actions pending a complete review of their legal basis. The financial audit David had demanded revealed even more problems than anyone had suspected. The missing reserve funds were eventually recovered, Bradley Hutchins was reported to the state bar for ethical violations, and new financial controls were implemented to prevent future abuse. Most importantly, the community adopted a new set of governing procedures that included term limits for board members, mandatory financial disclosure requirements, and a resident bill of rights that protected homeowners from the kind of harassment David had experienced. David's fence, of course, remained exactly where it had always been. But the real victory wasn't about the fence. It was about proving that ordinary people don't have to accept abuse from petty dictators who hide behind official titles and manufactured authority. 6 months later, David received a letter from a homeowner in a community in Texas who had heard about the Meadowbrook situation through online HOA forums. The homeowner was facing similar harassment from his HOA board and wanted David's advice on how to fight back. David's response was simple: document everything, know your rights, and never forget that these people work for you, not the other way around. The letter was the first of dozens David would receive over the following year. Word of his successful battle against HOA corruption had spread throughout the network of homeowner rights advocates, and David found himself becoming an unofficial consultant for residents facing similar situations across the country. Margaret Whitfield moved out of Meadowbrook Estates 8 months after her removal from the board. Neighbors reported seeing moving trucks at her house on a Tuesday morning, and by evening, she was gone without saying goodbye to anyone. Harold Brinkman lasted longer, but the social isolation that followed his involvement in the fence incident eventually drove him to sell his house and relocate to a community where his past wasn't known. Linda Morrison and Joyce Patterson both remained in the community, but kept low profiles and never sought HOA involvement again. Robert Kim was eventually elected to a full term as president and served with distinction for 4 years before stepping down to let fresh leadership take over. David's fence still stands today, providing privacy and protection just as it was designed to do. But more importantly, it stands as a symbol of what one person can accomplish when they refuse to be intimidated by bullies with clipboards and bad attitudes. The story of David Chen and his fence became something of a legend in Meadowbrook Estates. New residents were often told the story as both a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and an inspiring example of how ordinary people can fight back against abuse of power. But perhaps the most important lesson from David's victory is not about HOAs at all. It's about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's easier to just go along with the crowd. David could have torn down his fence. He could have paid the fines. He could have moved to a different community. Instead, he chose to fight, not just for himself, but for every resident who had been bullied, harassed, or intimidated by people who confused authority with power. In the end, Margaret Whitfield's biggest mistake wasn't underestimating David's legal skills or misreading the community covenants. Her biggest mistake was forgetting that in America, we don't have to accept abuse from anyone, regardless of what title they hold or what authority they claim to possess. Sometimes the little guy really can win, especially when the little guy knows the law and isn't afraid to use it. The fence at 1247 Sycamore Lane still stands today, a 6-foot cedar reminder that freedom isn't something that's given to us by others. It's something we have to be willing to defend for ourselves. And that's a lesson worth remembering. Whether you're dealing with an overzealous HOA board or any other bully who thinks a clipboard gives them the right to run your life. So the next time someone in a position of petty authority tries to push you around, remember David Chen and his fence. Remember that you have rights, you have options, and you have the power to fight back. Because sometimes the best defense against a bully is simply refusing to be bullied. What would you have done in David's situation? Would you have fought back? Or would you have torn down the fence to avoid the conflict? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this incredible story of one man's victory over HOA tyranny.